Guys, I'm really happy to welcome to the podcast Dr. Jason Hill. He's a professor of philosophy at DePaul University. He's the author of 5 books. He had a best-selling book called We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People. But the most recent book, the one we're going to be talking about, it's this one right here, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? It's the issue of reparations, a very provocative and interesting book. I just finished it, really enjoyed reading it. Professor Hill, thank you for joining me on the podcast. You know, it's kind of funny because Debbie, my wife, got a message through my website saying, I was reading Professor Jason Hill's book, and he was very critical of you, and it made me very angry. And I'm like, let me get a copy of this book to see if this is really true. And I found the book fascinating from start to finish. It's a book, of course, that's a meditation, philosophical, even psychological, on the issue of reparations. Now, when people think about reparations, they think about this idea that America is being asked to provide a compensation, not to an actual victim, but let's say to an historical victim. And I want to ask if that is a distinction, actual victims versus, let's call it, historical victims, that is one that is central to your argument or not.
Well, thanks, Dinesh, for having me. And I am a big fan of your work. So if I'm critical of you, it's in good faith. Yes, the distinction is very crucial because I think what's going on right here is that the claims of reparations are predicated on a historical set of victims with no indication of separating who actually among those victims are actually deserving of reparations, like from whom was property actually stolen, as we can ostensibly identify in the case of the Holocaust, or among the Japanese who were interned during World War II who lost property. This is a case of collapsing all individuals into a collective and making a collectivist claim that just because you are part of a set of individuals who share an ascriptive identity, you're deserving of reparations.
Now, you start this book, I think, in what was to me a surprising and very interesting way, and that is you begin really in Africa, and you talk about the fact that there was a slave trade going on within Africa. African kingdoms and chieftains who were capturing slaves, and then they became part of the transatlantic slave trade. And then you went in a direction that caught me by surprise. You said, how did the slave become a slave? And in one of your chapters, you have this amazing subtitle in which you talk about, I'm just going to find it, give me just a second. You talk about how the African made himself into a slave. Now, I've never heard it quite put that way. So say a word about what you're getting at here. You're talking about the underlying almost philosophical framework of ancient Africa and the way in which it differed from the framework of Europe. What is that difference?
The difference is that sub-Saharan Africa was dominated by what I call an animist philosophy, in which one does not distinguish oneself from the earth, from nature. One is a part of nature. One cannot abstract oneself from nature. And if one cannot abstract oneself from nature, as did the Europeans, then one cannot exploit nature to suit one's ends. One becomes like an animal. One adapts oneself to nature, as opposed to adapting nature to meet one's needs and desires. So in essence, the Africans, by their very primitive philosophy of animism, made themselves into slaves indirectly by making themselves indistinguishable from nature, so that when the Europeans arrived as conquerors, they were as indistinguishable from water buffalo, from minerals, from anything on the earth, and made themselves exploitable.
Now, this is such a startling point. I think we need to dwell on it a little bit, because am I understanding you to say something like this, that if I see myself as not separate from nature in the way that, say, the Bible specifies, human beings are special creation of God, nature and the animals are given to human beings in a sense for their care and use. If I see myself as just part of nature, are you saying that then I'm more like an antelope being pursued by a lion, And I don't really have any moral complaint against the lion because the lion too is part of nature. So if there's a degree of exploitation, so-called, within nature, you don't have a ground outside of nature to criticize it. We're all part of nature and we're all doing what, in a sense, nature commands.
Exactly. And yeah, I would agree with that. And I would even go a little bit further and say that if you are not extractable or you do not abstract yourself from nature, you cannot devise the technological means to defend yourself from invaders or from rapacious exploiters. You cannot devise the political vocabularies that discover or inoculate you from like property rights, like the concept of inalienability, inviolable moral worth, because you do not seek to do so by the very nature of your philosophy. So those who are chasing you are not necessarily chasing you because they see you as something different from themselves. They're chasing you because they're seeing you as part of an inseparable heap of nature itself. And that they're not saying, okay, these are, because the slave trade originated before the racial taxonomies of Western Europe started. So they weren't, I'm arguing that they weren't necessarily exploiting them as racial creatures. They were simply exploiting them as part of nature, the way they would sort of exploit any kind of mineral resource or any kind of animal source that they came upon and would use as part of the resources that they needed for their survival.
And are you saying, Jason, that much of the accoutrements of modern civilization, which is now not just Western, but global civilization, things like the dignity of man, moral claims, you mentioned property rights, are you saying that all of that traces back to the sort of distinction that we find in the Bible and in the Western tradition of separating man from nature and giving man a status apart from nature?
Absolutely. I mean, we have found elements of it within Stoic philosophy. That is the sort of inviolability or the intrinsic moral worth of human nature. But I don't think it comes to full fruition until we come to Judeo-Christianity, where we see an image that's made in the image. I mean, Christianity is a sort of eugenical moment because through Christ, everyone becomes remade, metaphysically remade in the image of a new man or a new person. And it's through Christianity that one really, really becomes endowed and suffused with the inviolability, the inalienability of rights that are deserving of one as a human being, that one is made in the image of God, which means one has a share in the divinity of God. And that one, more importantly, is not most emphatically a part of nature, but one is separate from nature itself. And that's what the animists have failed or had failed to discover. Let's say not create, but to discover, because one does not create these laws that are invariable. The one discovers them. Let's
take a pause, Jason. When we come back, I want to talk about the founding and, in fact, the supposed disagreement between you and me over the issue of the founding. We'll be right back.